Awesome. So now that everything is baked out, let's actually get to some of the painting here. So how do we start that? Well, in the right-hand side, we can see that we have our active material, our channel, and we have just a couple of options kind of down here that we can choose. So the right-hand one here is a new layer, and the left-hand one is a group. If you watch the Substance Painter one, you'll know that I kind of split up these different material sections with groups. So I'm going to click on the folder first, and that's going to add this folder to our stack. And yours might be a little taller like this. So let's call this tread, and this is where I'm going to put all of the different texturing layers, like in Photoshop or Painter, to texture this rubber portion of our model. So let's go and quickly add a new layer. So that's going to be this little kind of pancaked layers with the plus sign there. And we have a bunch of different options. And we're going to be taking a look at a couple of these throughout the course of this video, so don't worry. But what we want to look at right now is just a multi-channel layer. This is kind of the most simplest of layers. I know multi-channel sounds kind of complex, but trust me, this is the simplest layer that we can work with here in InstaMAT, because ultimately what it does is it just creates a layer that fills in every one of our texture channels that we're working with here. So you can see that when I click on that layer, we've got base color, height, roughness, metalness, ambient occlusion, and normal. And over on the right-hand side of each one of these are the colors that it's pretty much just flood filling for this layer across our entire UV. So I'm going to go and just drag and drop this into our tread folder. And the first thing I want to do is actually create a mask for this folder so that anything I'm creating in this folder is going to be applied only to that rubber portion. So if I click on the tread group here, and I head on down to this little add mask button, we're gonna have a bunch of different options. You'll probably have a bunch of these in your favorites by default. This is pretty much all of the mask options. I'm not really sure why they're all in favorites since it's pretty much all of them. But the one we're gonna want to go and select is this mesh ID. Now, if you don't have this in your favorites, just come on down to pick from library. It's going to bring up the library dialog box here, and it's going to already be filtered to all of the mask options we have. So I can just start to type in mesh ID, and we can see that we're going to have it right there. So we can just double click, and it's already going to select this area because the default color for the source color is already red, which is the ID color that we have on this mesh. So if I wanted to select something else, I can just click on the little eyedropper, and you can see that I can go and start to select these colors. So if I wanted it to be the hub, I could select that, or even our little air cap over there, I can do that. Just something quick to note as well, that we can also change the number of these. So if I did something like 3, now I can go and start to select different mesh IDs based off of our color selectors here. And really, I think the amount is, well, can we go more than 10? No, it looks like it's just 10 per mesh ID to mask. So again, if you have more than 10 things that you're trying to mask off, maybe reconsider your mesh ID map. But anyways, let's go and make sure that we have our rubber selected. And now we can go back to that multi-channel layer. I just want to set a base kind of layer value for each one of our channels so that as we start building up our layer stack and adding detail, there's detail underneath it that we can kind of blend together and help build up this material. Now you'll see that if I click back on this channel, all of those channel information layers have gone away, and it's just our layer projection type. Now it doesn't really matter what the projection type is for this particular channel because it's just a flood fill, right? It's just a solid fill of one color. But as we start using some different types of grunges and such, how we're actually projecting that detail onto our mesh is going to be somewhat important, but we're going to look at that in a bit. So to get back to those channels, if we go over to this little pancake stack of 3 different like sheets or layers, now we're going to be able to tackle each one of these. And I can go and start to, play with the color, can play with the roughness. Maybe a little hard to see, but I'm making it really, really glossy. It almost looks kind of like plastic or something. And so I just want to set this as my base layer so that when I'm adding stuff, it's actually building on top of things. So I'm going to click this little color box here, and I'm going to go and quickly just color pick a value off my screen here. So it's going to be a dark black. I'm going to set my height value to around 0.5 there so that we can either go and add or subtract height information. Now it's not going to change much in our 3D view. I'm also going to just quickly color pick off screen as well to set my roughness at about 30% or 35%. Here we can actually just go and do 0.35 to set that exactly at 35%. So it's going to be pretty matte, but still kind of, glossy. And then I can just go and quickly, hide those layers. Again, we're going to still have them contributing, but we're not going to do any details or any changes to them. So that's going to be it for our base layer, but let's go and add some roughness and some height variation to the tire to give it some kind of surfacing texture. So it's not just, kind of nice and smooth all the way around. So I'll go and add a new multi-channel layer over top of this. And let's call this rubber surface. Now, like I said, I don't want this to contribute any color. I just want it to be height and roughness. So if we come down to this multi-channel layering system, you'll see that each one of these has a slider of 0 to 100%. And this is the contribution of this channel to the overall material for each one of these texture channels. So what that means is that this is right now contributing 100% of the output of this color slider to our base color texture channel output. But if I don't want this layer to contribute any color, what I can do is just drag this all the way down to 0. And once I do that, it actually turns it off. So this is no longer contributing any color information. Even though you can see that the color is blue, this layer is not contributing color information. So I also want to do that for metalness, AO, and normal. I just want to stick with our height and our roughness. So to get started with our height, let's bring this up from 0% all the way up to something like, what does my research suggest? Maybe something like 0.28, it's around 28%. And I'll bring the roughness down, and I'll start using these sliders as well. Do something around, actually we'll make this around 60%, so it's a little bit rougher. Now that hasn't added any variation yet, but I want to go and add a mask to this layer so that it's only using this height and roughness in certain areas that we have masked off. So again, clicking on this rubber surface, coming down to our masks button. I'm going to our library just so that we can always find these just in case we're watching this video and we don't have those as favorited. And I'm going to look for Mesh Mask Builder. So if we quickly read the description of this, basically what it's going to tell us, oops, if I don't click on that, it's going to allow us to kind of create our own mask based off of a couple of parameters and different grunge textures as well. So this is kind of the equivalent of the mask builder in Substance Painter. Here we have the equivalents. So that's going to add the mask builder to our layer here. And now we have some options to go and play with to actually create something a little bit unique. So what I'd like to do is come on down to where it says Grunge 1, because this is going to allow us to plug in essentially a grunge texture that InstaMAT provides and use that to drive some of the variance. So before we can see that, we have to bring the opacity up. And you'll see that once I bring it either above or below 0, it's going to give us all these options. And now the second option in this header is going to be image. Now by default, it's just going to give us a black and white. You can see that if I bring this all the way up, right now it's 100% white, this mask. So it's just going to be using that layer entirely. And a value of 0 is going to be completely black. Now, if I go and click on this little pencil, you'll see that it's going to bring up our search dialog box where we can start to use some of these grunges. So I'm going to use a clouds heavy, and it maybe isn't in grunges, so let's search everywhere. And we can just take a look quickly if it brings up the image there. It's just going to be a relatively noisy grunge map. If I double click that, right now we can see that we're getting some of that information variance in our texture here. And it's looking really cool, but I find that it's a little bit tough to see what's going on exactly because I can't see the mask itself. So if I select this mask here and I hit S on my keyboard, this is going to solo, and you can see that it's got that little S symbol beside it, going to solo that particular channel or mask and display it in our 3D viewport. So this is the mask that we've created so far. So I want to bring the scale of this up to something like 10. I want to bring the frequency gain down to something like 0.1. And I'll also bring the frequency smooth down to something like 0.2. So that we're going to get something looking kind of like that. And then if I bring the gamma up to say around 7, now you can see we're just getting some kind of splotchy areas where this layer is actually going to be showing up on our model. So now if I hit S again to stop soloing that, right, it's gone away. You can also go and just click on this little S there. This is the effect of this layer on top of our base layer, and it's all going to be because of our mask, right? So if I just click this X, I think the X is kind of a bit of a misnomer here, or a bit of a confusing element, because I expect that I'm going to delete this layer, but actually it's just hiding. So you can see original, and once we've gone and added this layer. All right, so that was a lot of talking just to kind of get us through our first layer. But now that we've got, you know, one under our belts, let's take a look at kind of starting to build this up a little bit more rapidly. So the next layer I want to do is going to just be another kind of roughness grunge layer. So I'm going to add a multi-channel layer. Let's go and call this roughness. And I want to get rid of all of its layers except for the roughness layer, obviously, right? That's what we're using this layer for. And I'm going to set this to around a value of 70. And I'm actually holding control as I slide this to snap to 10° or 10% increments. So something like 70, which is a little rougher. And let's go and create another mask. And I'm going to do a mesh mask builder. You should probably have it down in recently used if you don't have it in your favorites. And let's slide on down to grunge 1 again, where we can go and increase the opacity. And we're going to use a new grunge map this time. Again, remembering to click on the pencil under image. And the one that I found looked really cool was called Rampage. And if we take a quick look at this here, right, it's just kind of really grungy in areas and kind of open in others. It's got a nice balance of rest and detail, I think. So already out of the box, I think that's working pretty good by default. You can go and play around with things like the balance or the contrast for the image to get something, you know, a little more fine-tuned to what you need. But I think by default, that's going to be pretty cool. Now for our next layer, I want to go and start adding some text, which I can wrap around our tire here so that it deforms to the curvature of the rubber. And if we recall, that's how we kind of intentionally tried to lay out our UVs so that things would wrap around depending on how we actually projected them onto our model or our UVs here in InstaMAT or Substance Painter. So let's go and add a new multi-channel layer, and I'll call this text. And so what we're going to be doing for this layer is I'm going to just quickly grab the text color. And again, as I'm grabbing these, you can start pausing the video and start, you know, sampling these colors here as well if you want to be super close to what we're doing in the video. I'm also going to set our height to around something like 60 because we want this to be raised off of the background as well. And then I'm going to make these a little bit shinier. So the default roughness might be around 30%. And then again, we don't need to have any metalness, ambient occlusion, or normals. We're just going to have these contribute color, height, and roughness. So I'm going to come back up to our text and add a new mesh mask builder mask. And if we come back down to grunge yet again, making sure to turn the opacity on, and selecting our image, if I start to go and type in text and we go and search everywhere, you'll see that we have a couple different options for this. But one of them is actually, if we take a look, the result of an InstaMAT element graph. And that's the whole other component of InstaMAT here, is that not only can we go and texture models like this, we can also use a node-based system, much like Substance Designer, to go and create a lot of materials and tiling patterns and things that we can then come back into the layering projects and use for texturing our models. So it's really an all-in-one package, which is really neat. But again, we're going to want to use this text graph here. So if I double click on that, you can see that we're going to get a bunch of text kind of all over the place here. So first and foremost, let's just worry about our text first. So I'm going to just put chunks tires as our text, and you'll see that that's gone ahead and updated. You're not going to really be able to see the results of that, but hopefully you can kind of see that it has changed a little bit. So our next issue is to figure out how we can actually position this on our UV so that it works with the contours of our model. Now, if we take a look down a couple options here, we can see that we have projection mode. And this is the same as if we take a look in the layers with our layer projection. We're going to have three different options. So let's go back to our mask. We're going to have triplanar, which pretty much everything you add by default is going to be set to. And that's why we're getting this cube box here. This is actually a gizmo that we can start to play around with. And it is projecting effectively this texture on our model from three directions, hence triplanar, right? It's projecting from our X, as I went on the Z, our Z and our Y, and casting it across our model, which is then going to hit our model and then start to display that text on it. Now, if I want to visualize this in 2D, I can go and right click our mask and go to view output for current channel, view composite output for current channel, this one here. So we can see that this is what our UVs are looking like. And as we move this around, it's going to basically kind of bake this into our model based off of those three directional projections. And it's going to distort the text on our UVs to kind of match that 3D view. So that's not what I want. I don't want to do that really with this projection in 3D and then kind of have it distort in our 2D. I want to go ahead and project a two-dimensional kind of text in our UVs here and have it conform to the contours of our model. But this is kind of backwards to how I want this to work, right? I want to go and just lay out some text here and have it work with the bend of the tire. And unfortunately, as of right now in InstaMAT, working within your 2D viewport here just really isn't possible whatsoever. And actually, I believe if I go and I add a brush layer and click on it, a paintbrush is active, but it can currently only be used in the 3D viewport. 2D painting will be supported soon. So for right now, 2D only works for viewing. It doesn't work for editing, unfortunately. So we're going to have to kind of do a little bit of a workaround that I found, which works fine, but it's a little unintuitive. So what we want to do is switch the projection mode from triplanar to UV. So now you can see that it is projecting it in a two-dimensional direction based off of our UVs here. The caveat with that is that we get no gizmos or doodads or UI to actually work in 2D. It still all is in 3D. So again, this is very early days for InstaMAT. I'm sure this will all be ironed out as time goes by, but I wanted to try and get this video out as soon as I can for people. And so unfortunately, this is something we're just gonna have to live with for the time being. But you can see that as I bring this down, if we can kind of try to recall where we've UV'd that tire area, you can see that we're going to start to be able to get that projecting correctly and much more to what we intended when we initially set out to do this. So let's go and set the text size to something like really low, really 0.03. Yeah, that looks all right. So you'll see that if I bring this up a little bit, and then if I go along the X, now again, if you go and try and do the, oh, of course, it's gone back a couple steps there. There we go. If you try and move it along the Z, it's not going to do anything because remember, we're technically working in UV space. So it works with the X and the Y coordinates. So if you want to move it left or right, go ahead and move it on the X, up and down, move it on the Y. Now what's really cool is we can also, if I just go and remove this 2D view here, I'm just going to close that by pressing it up there. We can also go and change the font type. So coming back into the mask, we can see that we are using this, I'm not even going to pretend to try and pronounce that, regular OTF file. But if we click right beside it here, you'll see that we have a bunch of different fonts. And now I don't know if it works with system fonts that you have installed as well, because I do have some of these installed, but I'm not exactly certain if they've also just come with InstaMAT. So that's something to look out for. But I want to go ahead and select this freshman one. Now again, if this is just a custom font that I've installed at some point in time on my computer and it's picking from there, I apologize. But you can go ahead and take a look online at font websites like DaFont and get something kind of cool and custom for yourself if you would like. So if I double click that, we can see that now we're going to get a, a much more kind of like battle hardened kind of, masculine bravado type of text font for our tires. And that's going to look pretty cool. So now I want to come back to my text layer just because I'm noticing that the white is maybe a little too bright. And what I'm going to do is drop down the base color. Now I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we can actually do that in two different places. Previously, we've been doing it down here, but just by clicking on each one of these layers and then just swapping out the intensities or the values. But we can also change the intensity of each channel's contribution up here in our layer stack with these sliders here. So if I click on this, double click, I'm going to set that to 50%. And you can see that that's also updated down here. Now I did have to click away. It still said it was 100. But if you click away and click back, you can see that these values are going to be connected. And then if I wanted to change maybe the height's contribution, right, I can go and change this channel to be height. And then say this is 20%. If I click away, right, you can see now that it's updated that channel's opacity. I'm just going to set this back to 100, go back to base color, and that's going to be it for our text here. But again, looking pretty good, and I'm glad that it's conforming to the rotation of our tire. So our next layer is going to just be another kind of like grungy, dirty layer that I want to use because obviously you can't get dirty enough with tires. They're pretty much existing in a world of dirt at all times, being, so close to the ground and in contact with it so much. So let's go and just add a new layer. But this time, let's go and add an element layer. So if I click on that, you'll see that it's not going to be just a simple flood fill layer, but a little bit more complicated. Right, we're getting like full on materials with this option. And so just a quick note, I had mentioned it previously with the text node or the text graph, but these are actual element layers or node-based graphs that are built in InstaMAT, and we get to use them as different interesting textures and materials that we add to our layers as channels as well. So the layer that I'd like to use is called Asphalt Dirty. If I type in asphalt, there we go, Asphalt Dirty. And if we take a look at the thumbnail here, it's just a kind of grungy, dirty texture, which realistically you might be able to find kind of on a tire material because, again, it's in contact with this type of surface very often, as well as just taken me until right now to realize that this whole time I've actually been working in 4K. So this is a good reminder that if you find things aren't working very quickly or you want to swap between resolutions that you're working in, you're not stuck to the original resolution you defined. If I come on up to the left-hand side, you can see that we have this 4x4K, 16 bits per pixel. So if I click that, you can see that this whole time I've accidentally been working in 4K. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but if I click on that and then just click on 2K, it's going to drop everything down to 2K, be a little bit lower res, but it's going to be quicker for things to load as we're working through this project. So I want to go and first play with some of the parameters that come with this material. And that's one of the reasons why you'd maybe want to go ahead and start using some of these element layers, is that they come with their own parameters to really change the final result of this layer. So I'm going to drop our normal strength down to something like 25% because I don't want this to be too rugged. Again, we're going to be using this more as like just slight dirt in certain areas. It's not going to be contributing too much height variance. I'm also going to get rid of some of these cracks. You can see that some of that grunge starts to disappear. I just want to keep a lot of this noise. Awesome. So now that we've got a pretty decent just kind of dirt material, let's go and mask it off. Let's go and add a mesh mask builder yet again, probably one of the most common mask tools you're going to be using during your time with InstaMAT. And this time, let's go and select our ambient occlusion. Again, dragging the opacity all the way up to 1. I'm going to hit S on my keyboard just so I can, again, solo that mask channel so I can see what it's actually doing. I'm also going to drag down the brightness, maybe just a touch, maybe negative 0.1, so that we're going to have something like that. Now it's very, very slight. You can kind of see some of that specular dust, right, kind of in the crevices here. It's not really going to contribute a whole lot. However, if I come on down to this layer ambient occlusion, and I drag the opacity of that all the way up, now you'll see that we're starting to get some details from previous layers. And this is really cool. And honestly, I think this is something that is really an advantage over something like Substance Painter, is that we can use the information from previous channels to start adding some grunge. Now, I know before I get too far ahead, yes, Substance Painter does have this ability. But what I'll say is that setting up anchor points and trying to keep track of anchor points is probably the bane of my existence and one of the most confusing processes in that entire application. So the fact that this application can just understand and know and take into consideration that these layers are also contributing to our ambient occlusion channel as a whole, absolute game changer for me. Again, sorry, that's a side tangent, but I think it's really cool that we can start to use the previous layer's information to start building up some of these grunges too. So we can increase the brightness here, maybe something like 0.4. We can even increase the radius, right? You can see that it's kind of, especially around the text, really bumping that up to maybe something like 0.7, right? We're getting a bit of a glow around that where maybe dirt would start to collect, because if we recall, right, these are kind of protruded from the surface of the tire. And then you can change things like, again, the balance, if you want more or less, or even the contrast and such. But I think this is going to be all right for now. So now if I hit S again and get rid of that solo, right here is before and after with some of that dirt. So it's a very subtle effect. But again, adding to some of that believability that in some of those corner areas, we're going to be collecting some dirt. Now let's keep going. And the next thing I want to do is I want to add some circular detail to the tire, like we saw with the tractor tread that we created in that bonus video, where I went and actually indented the side of the tire using the mesh. We can also get a similar effect just by using textures and keeping the overall base mesh rather simple. So we can achieve the same effect by doing it a different way. It really depends on which way works best for your workflow. And depending on if you need extra flexibility, you might want to consider not baking in certain details versus texturing them in. So it all depends on your project and what you want to do, but we can take a look at how we can do that here. So I'm going to add a new multi-channel layer, and I'll call this ridge. And coming down to the layers, we don't need it to contribute color, roughness, metalness, or normal. So let's go and add a mask. This time I'm going to pick from library because we're going to want to look for, if I can spell it correctly, a mesh projected mask. Again, I want to show you just a little thumbnail. So this is going to allow us to project something onto our model and use whatever we're projecting as the mask. So again, we're going to get this familiar GUI here where we can start to move things around. You can see that something is happening. We're not entirely certain what it is, but something is happening. And we have this new projection type, which is decal or decal, however you want to say it. So what's actually going on with this? Well, let me choose a better shape. So again, up here at image, we can choose different things to be used as our mask. I'm going to go and type in ring because I want to have a ring shape like this. And if I just kind of scroll down a little bit back to our layer projection and I change the scale of this down to be something like 0.3, and I move this around, hopefully you can kind of see what's going on is it's projecting that ring shape onto our model here, but it's only in one direction. So this is maybe where it gets a little confusing, especially if you set this to decal and you're not exactly sure where it's projecting from. It is only projecting from one direction. You can see that as I remove this volume from our tire there, it starts to kind of cut off because it's no longer projecting. It's not projecting far enough, right? The bounds of this box cut off right here. So what needs to happen is we actually have to go and rotate this. So if I rotate this 90 degrees on the y-axis here, and I start to move my light around, you can see now we're getting this ring projecting on the correct side. So I'm going to reset my translation, reset my scale, so that now we're getting this projecting correctly. It's projecting along the z-axis, I believe, at all times. I don't know if you can change that or not. So just kind of rule of thumb when you're using this decal mode is it's going to project along the direction of this blue gizmo here. I'm also going to change my environment. So I'm going to hit I on my keyboard to bring up my environments and maybe click on this one. Is this a good one? Okay, cool. So now that we've got this projecting the correct direction, I have to go and tweak this a little bit. So I'm going to maybe set the scale up. Oh, I keep doing that. Scale of 1.07 so that it's going to be closer to the outside of our tread, or kind of where the pattern goes. If I zoom in here too, you'll see that it looks kind of like jagged, based off of the filtering of this pattern that we've used, the ring pattern. So if I change our filtering mode from nearest to bilinear smooth anti-aliased, that's going to really smooth things out there, make it a lot crisper. And then I also want to come down to adjustments and just change the blur on this a little bit. Maybe something like we can do 0.12. There we go. So that's looking pretty cool. And another cool thing about these decals or decals is that you can see right now on the other side, right? It is kind of casting through because it's casting in the Z direction within this bounding box. But if for whatever reason I didn't want this on this side here, I can just move this so that it's outside of the bounding box, right? And we're no longer going to have that. But if I come over here, right, we can still see that we're getting that projection on our exterior of the tire. So that's really handy with this type of workflow. So if I come back to the ridge material layer now, and I go, you know what, I want to kind of deepen the intensity of this normal contribution. So we'll see with my height, I can't go any lower than 0% and I can't go any higher than 100, right? What's really cool about InstaMAT is that for most properties, these are just soft locks. If I click on our little pencil button there and I go to value, and if I do something like negative 0.15, hopefully you saw that that actually got a little bit deeper. And again, something like negative 0.5, now it's starting to get a lot deeper. So we can decrease values or increase them beyond just the scope of the slider to better fit the situations that we're going to need. So you can see that even though it appears to be black, because we are decreasing the value a lot more, the system is converting this height map into a normal map at the end of the day. And again, I just hit C to go into my channel preview mode here for our normal. So even though the value is for the eye appear black, the actual value is going to be what's red at the end of the day. So that's a bit of a hack for you right there, as we can start to use values way outside of the sliders if we kind of know what we're doing here. So that's looking cool, but I would really love if this could capture some of that dirt that we had been using for some of these, kind of rubbery areas and along the text, right? Well, it's very simple. All we have to do is just drag the dirt above that layer. I'll make sure I drop it correctly. There we go. And if we recall, right, because we are using the layer ambient occlusion from the previous layers, it's going to now pick up on this ridge and start to add some of that dust and that kind of grunge buildup, which is looking really cool. However, we'll notice that we're getting some weirdness kind of at the seam lines here. So to quickly go ahead and fix that, I'm going to add a new mesh map, and let's go and do, if I type in paint, you'll see that we have this mesh mask painting, which is going to allow us to just start painting on top. Now I'd like to change the blend mode because I don't want to start, painting on and multiplying like that. I'd rather just paint to subtract some of that information. So instead, let's go and just click subtract. I'm going to hold down Alt, left click, and then move my mouse cursor down. You can also change, the brush radius and stuff from over here, but the hotkeys are just left click, Alt, and move your mouse down. And now if I start to do that, we can start to paint away. Now I would like to have, if I can find it, I believe it is under dynamics, not size, position. Here we go. Right, you can see we start changing the dynamics and having a brush that kind of gets a little bit noisier. So that might work a little bit better there. Might be a little too much. Just so that we're not getting a very straight kind of edge there, right? It's going to be a little bit grungier. And we'll come in and do the bottom again. Remember that we had two seams for these pieces here. Awesome. So that's looking really, really cool. So that's going to conclude our time with the tread. I think it's looking really good, to be honest. I'm really happy with how this has turned out. Hopefully you are as well, if you've been following along. And I'd like to move on to the other components of our tire here. So next up, we're going to move on to the hub. So let's go and create a new mask, or a new group, sorry, called hub. And now I'd like to go and add a mesh ID to mask. And instead of red, let's go and select green. And now within this hub, if I go and add a new layer, let's go and add a new element layer. And I'm going to look for titanium. titanium. There we go, if I can spell it correctly. So we have a bunch of different, base metal materials which were built in InstaMAT. I'm just going to go and select titanium default here. And if we add this to our hub group, hopefully we can see that we've masked that off correctly, but if we haven't, you'll be able to see it very quickly. So I'm going to use this as our kind of underlying metal coat here, which is really cool. So let's call this titanium. So there's not much I'm going to really want to do to change this layer per se. You can come in and change some of the parameters, like some of the height. Actually, I might change the height to be something like 10, just so we're not getting a lot of height variation. The next thing I'd like to do is I'm going to start to build up each one of these individual layers for the hub. So the next thing that we'd find generally over the bare metal is something like rust. Let's go and add a new element layer. I'm going to search for rust. And I think I just went with this rust default here. And we take a look. Yeah, there we go. So that's going to look really cool, really rusty. And again, it will come with a bunch of parameters that we can play around with. But for how small it's going to be on our model, I don't really think I'm going to play around with it. And for sake of time as well, let's just make sure to call this rust. But now what I would like to do is I would like to go ahead and add a new mask. And this time, I'd like to search for mesh edge wear mask. So if I go ahead and solo this layer, we can see that we're getting some grunginess, we're getting some scratches, and it's looking pretty cool, but we're going to need to tweak it a little bit. So coming on over to our curvature mask, the first thing I'd like to crank up is our grunge opacity so that we're getting some of those kind of like speckled areas along the edges. I'm going to move my grunge mask down to maybe like 70% and my grunge variance up. You can see that it's pretty uniform without that grunge variance, so I want to kind of vary up those larger details. And then I'm going to quickly dial back some of these parameters here. Again, you're going to get different mileage for each one of these opacity sliders based on what your baked curvature is, because we're using that baked curvature. So your parameters here might be a little bit different than mine. But I think I'm going to want to get something that looks kind of like that, where we just have some edge wear kind of along those convex areas. So now if I hit S on my keyboard, right, we're going to be getting just some of that edge wear where it's kind of scratched down to base metal. And actually it still is looking a little bit too uniform. So let me just take a look at fixing that up. And then I might just change the contrast of this just a little bit. There we go. So that we're getting something kind of like that. That's looking all right, but let's go and finally add one more layer. So if I go to a new element layer, I'm going to type in glossy. I can spell glossy correctly. I don't think there's been one thing I've typed in so far that I've spelled correctly. I'm going to look for the glossy paint burgundy. And that's going to give us this nice kind of painted coat here. So the first thing I'd like to do is change our color. I'm going to snag a color. Oop, if I select this guy here and snag a color off screen so that we're getting something kind of a little orangier there. I would like to go and Control C to copy and Control V to paste this mask here so that we're getting a very similar mask in all the areas that we had for the rust to the titanium. And what I'd like to do is just kind of increase the intensity or the settings on these so that we're going to be getting a blend of titanium to rust to this painted metal layer. So I think that's looking pretty cool. I think we're going to be able to get that kind of metal rusty paint blend. Again, fine tuning that to better fit what you have going on for your model, but I think that's going to work for what we want to do. Now, before we close out our hub here, I did kind of just gloss over some of the stuff that I like to do for this paint here. We come back to and I'll just call this paint layer. There was a little area, if I can find it, yes, the bubbles amount. If we drag this guy up, you can see that we start to get some kind of like air bubbles on the surface of this material. And I think that really just kind of adds a little bit of that really cool extra detail that I just didn't want to skip out on before we cover the next section. So play around with this layer. Again, I know I didn't cover too much with it, but I think you get the idea of element layers by this point. So let's go and move on now to our final material section, which is going to be air cap. And I want to make sure that I don't. My one feedback for this software is I really hate moving around layers. So if there's any developers for some reason watching this video, I would love if we made moving around layers a lot more straightforward and visible to where I'm actually dropping these layers. That'd be really cool. All right, side tangent aside, let's go and start to move on to our air cap. So like always, let's go and create a mesh ID mask. Select our color here. Oh, I want to click on this little eyedropper. There we go. Select our blue guy there. And again, like we did for the tread, I'm just going to set a base multi-channel layer so that we have some data already set so that we can start layering on top of it. So I'll call this base. I'm going to select a color off screen here. If I just go and set the base color, I'm going to set the height to be 50%, the roughness to be 50%, and then I'm not going to want any metalness, 100% ambient occlusion, and we can just leave the normal as is. So we're going to get the perfectly balanced default layer. Really the only thing I would like to be able to add to this layer, again, because of one, just how small it is, and two, realistically, there's not a lot we can do to make this more interesting, is I'd like to add that kind of rib texture along the top of this cap, right? So when you would be twisting it off, there would be some ribs here to kind of help grip this cap. Let's go and add a new multi-channel layer, and I'll call this ribbed. I'm going to remove the base color, the roughness, metalness, AO, and normal. We're just going to be using this for height. And now instead of just using a slider and then trying to mask this off, what would be cool, I thought, was that we can actually go, if I click on one of these different buttons here, you can see that we can choose different ways to provide this with some information. So let me just go and hide those. So we can see that we can provide this with an element graph. So like those node-based materials I was talking about. We can also provide it with an image resource. So I'm going to select graph, and if I come on down to the pencil and I start to type in gradient, and I'm going to make sure I'm looking in patterns, we're going to have this gradient symmetric texture. So now we're using this node or this graph to generate the height information. So let me just bring this up. And again, we're not going to be able to see the transform. I wish there was a way, and maybe there is a way that I'm unaware of, to be able to actually view this as we're doing it. But really, from what I've seen, it's just going to be this little thumbnail here. So a count of 1 is not going to do a whole lot, right? It's doesn't look too great on our model. But as I start to increase the amount, right, we can see that we're starting to create that ribbed texture, which is looking kind of interesting. But if I go ahead and set this to something like 100 and I hit enter, you'll see that we're going to override the range, which is really cool that InstaMAT will allow us to do this. It's going to warn you that you're doing that first, but it is going to allow you to do it. You'll see that we're not getting that lining up correctly. It looks kind of odd, right? Now, if you recall from some of the previous layers we did, changing the projection type really helped us define the correct orientation for our materials. So with this ribbed texture, if I come back to layer projection, right, we're getting this triplanar. So what's going on right now is it's displaying this texture in 3 different directions and then just projecting that onto our model, which is not really what we want. We'll remember that we laid out this area very flat in our UVs, and we want it to map to the UVs correctly in that 2-dimensional space. So instead of triplanar or decal this time, we're going to use UV. So now we'll see that it is looking like it's aligned to our UVs correctly, right? We're getting it running around the cylinder here. And I'm not sure, maybe we can take a look at the final composite. It doesn't look like it. Well, that's too bad. But we can see that it is looking like it's going along the UVs, right? So now if we come back to our layers, we can very simply rotate this texture just by going to its parameters and typing in 90 so that we have it going up and down along the correct orientation there. So now let's maybe crank this up to something like 180. And again, yes, we're going outside of the range. That's okay, right? So that something is, it's going to look a lot more accurate to the frequency of these ridges here. Now we can also play with the intensity of the height here. You can see it is looking pretty crazy by actually dragging these ranges a little bit. Now this slider might be a little bit different than what you're used to because it doesn't really exist in really any other application I've ever seen. But it is really neat because what it is allowing us to do is kind of operate like a levels node you maybe would see in something like Substance Designer, where I can drag the final like outputs for these values to kind of remap this gradient. And you can see that as I'm increasing this, right, the overall image is getting brighter because I'm dragging up or increasing the lowest pixel value to something like 0.62. So the lowest or darkest pixel in this gradient is 0.62. And again, we can do that for the output of the high end. So we're going to get something more like that, which is a little bit of a less contrasted height difference. And now that I'm satisfied with this, let's look at masking this off. Now, I kind of saved this to the end of the video because this was the most frustrating part, I think, for me in trying to figure this out. And I think right now it is just a limitation of not being able to paint in a 2D view because there's really no easy way to mask this off. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to go and add a mesh mask painting node. And I'm going to swap the blending mode of this mask to be subtract so that when I go ahead and paint, we are going to be masking away. So you can see that as I start to paint over top of this, we're going to be able to just quickly go ahead and get rid of some of that. Now let me just change the softness to be a little bit higher. And again, this is not the most fun workflow, I'll say, to try and do it this way, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to do it any other way. And again, this would be a lot easier if we could just go ahead and paint in a 2D view, but for the time being, that doesn't seem to be an option. Now, if you're watching this well into the future, and it is, I would very much highly recommend you do it that way because trying to paint on this when I can't seem to really zoom to get any closer as well, just is a bit of a pain in the butt. But fortunately, it is a very small piece on our overall model. So again, you know, a little bit of a messy mask is really not going to be too bad. So we are getting close to finishing up this model. But the last thing I like to do generally for my texturing phases is create a global layer that we have some grunge and stuff to kind of tie everything together. Because right now I've been doing some grunge on each individual area. Well, not even the air cap, but kind of the different material sections. So I use a final grunge pass to kind of blend it all together so that it kind of adheres to everything in kind of like a uniform environment. So let's add a Final layer, I'll call this global so that we can put any kind of global grunges and stuff in it. And I'm just going to use a multi-material, multi-channel layer. So let's go and grab a kind of dingy brown color. That's actually not brown as I thought. There we go. Something like that. I'm not going to have it contribute any height. Actually make sure that the metalness is 100%, right? And we have it at black because dirt is not going to be metal. I'm going to leave the roughness at, actually maybe I'll bring that up a little bit because dirt is probably not going to be super rough. And I'll leave the AO and the normal as well. So we're just going to get rid of the height. Let's go and put this in our global, call it dirt. And now it's time to generate a mask. So I'm going to use the builder. Let's see, this is the mesh mask. Yep, there we go, mesh mask builder. And I'm going to solo that layer, hitting S on my keyboard. So let's come on down to ambient occlusion, drag that up. I'm going to skip over our layer ambient occlusion. But what I'm going to do is come on down to grunge, bring that up. And I'd like to use a grunge called, if I start to type in moisture, eroded moisture. And again, it's just a kind of another cool grungy map here. So now if I hit S to get out of isolation mode there, right, we can see what this layer is doing is just kind of adding a bit of cohesion to the overall model. Now this mask might be a little extreme. We can go and maybe change the opacity on this. Something like, I'll do 0.6. I think that looks good. But here's a before and an after. And we'll go to the other side of our tire as well because I've been kind of neglecting that. And I think it's looking really good overall. I'm actually very satisfied with what we've been able to accomplish with our time here in InstaMAT. Now that's going to conclude this video, but in the next one, we're going to look at how we can export these textures we've created so that we can use them in a game engine like Unreal.